Isaac's mornings were usually quiet, unremarkable. A cup of coffee that often went cold before he could finish it. A quick glance in the mirror. Maybe a self-assured nod if he was feeling particularly good that day. But this morning was different. He felt it the second he opened his eyes, a gnawing disquiet under his skin, like a strange itch he couldn't scratch. Rubbing his face, Isaac stumbled into the bathroom, eyes still blurred with sleep. The usual mirror greeted him, its smudged edges a testament to his casual indifference to dusting, and he leaned in, prepared for his routine nod. But instead of his own familiar face, a stranger stared back. It was subtle at first, a small thing he might have missed if he hadn't been looking directly into his own eyes, or the eyes that should have been his. He blinked, thinking maybe it was the remnants of sleep making him see things. But there was no escaping the truth as his vision cleared. The face staring at him was different. He leaned closer, pressing his hands onto the cold edge of the sink. The texture of the porcelain bit into his palms, grounding him as he looked deeper. The face in the mirror held his gaze, but something about it was wrong, an uncanny wrongness that made his stomach tighten. The eyes were sharper, their color slightly darker, as if they belonged to someone who'd seen more of the world than he had, someone who was in on secrets Isaac would never be allowed to know. The mouth was fuller, the lips curving in a subtle, almost mocking smirk that he'd never been able to pull off. Isaac didn't have the kind of confidence this face was expressing, the kind that bordered on arrogance. He tried to smile, just to see if the face would smile back the way he expected. But his reflection moved slowly, as if on its own accord, the smile forming at its own pace, careful, deliberate, almost taunting. It was the sort of smile you'd expect from a person who always knew what to say, who could command a room with a glance. Not Isaac. A chill crept up his spine as he studied the reflection. Maybe I'm still half asleep, he thought, grabbing his toothbrush as a distraction. But he couldn't look away, couldn't ignore the tiny thrill in his chest, an alien excitement he didn't want to acknowledge. He'd always admired people with that kind of charisma, people who seemed naturally magnetic. Part of him had even wished he could be like them. He brushed his teeth with his eyes glued to the mirror, refusing to let go of his own gaze, and noticed that his hand moved differently, a touch more confident, more self-assured, as if he was brushing his teeth in front of an audience. Every motion felt amplified, sharper, like he was moving for someone else. The toothbrush scraped against his teeth with a harshness he didn't usually use, the bristles scratching his gums until they bled slightly. He winced, spitting a thin stream of red into the sink, but the face in the mirror barely reacted, the smirk remaining intact. "Who are you?" he murmured, his voice low, barely a whisper. But it was enough to send a faint shiver through him, a prickling at the back of his neck that told him he wasn't alone. He shook his head, laughing a little at himself. It was ridiculous, really. Just sleep deprivation, he reasoned. Too many late nights, too much work. But as he turned to leave the bathroom, he felt compelled to look back, just one more time. And that's when he saw it. The face in the mirror didn't just look at him. It watched him, its gaze lingering even after he'd turned away, as if it was waiting for something he wasn't ready to give. A small whisper slid into his mind, almost like a thought that wasn't his own. Finally, he stumbled out of the bathroom, his heart pounding. He moved to the kitchen, trying to distract himself with routine, hoping the banality of breakfast would erase the lingering feeling of wrongness. But as he poured his cereal, He found himself pausing, watching the milk swirl around the bowl, his mind racing with 1,000 questions he couldn't answer. Who was that face? How could he wake up looking like someone he'd never been? He found himself remembering moments from his past, awkward interactions, chances he'd let slip by because he was too cautious, too timid. There had been times when he'd wanted to speak up, to be more assertive, but something had always held him back. A fear of stepping out of line, a fear of drawing too much attention. He'd always chosen to blend in, to keep himself safe. And now, he thought, maybe I'm seeing the man I could have been. The thought made him grip the counter, his knuckles white against the smooth surface. The stranger in the mirror wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was a manifestation, a twisted reflection of everything he'd suppressed, every part of himself he'd tried to keep hidden. And that face, confident, a little dangerous, was the face he'd denied, the one that had always been waiting beneath the surface. He glanced down at his hands. They looked the same, rough, calloused from years of work, familiar. But when he lifted his head and caught his reflection in the hallway mirror, he swore the stranger was there again, watching him from a distance, eyes gleaming with dark amusement. Isaac took a shaky breath. The face in the mirror wasn't just a face. It was a challenge, a dare. It was asking him to embrace a part of himself he'd spent his whole life running from. And for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to say no. The apartment was dim and silent, almost claustrophobic. Isaac had drawn all the curtains shut, preferring the shadows over the daylight. In his mind, light meant exposure. Exposure meant vulnerability. The stranger's face in the mirror was more active during the day, it seemed. In the dark, he could just be Isaac. He sat alone at his kitchen table, surrounded by an assortment of objects from his past. They were strewn haphazardly, items he'd dug out from storage boxes, old drawers, closets he rarely opened. A few faded photographs, a brittle notebook filled with scribbled dreams from college, a wristwatch with a cracked face he hadn't worn in years. Each item was a breadcrumb trail leading back through his life, a life he'd shaped carefully, with restraint. The life of a man who never took too many risks. He picked up a photograph, staring at the younger version of himself with his parents. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, firm, an echo of his expectations, of the weight Isaac had felt as a boy to be quiet, to blend in. He remembered all the times he'd been urged to keep his thoughts to himself, to not make waves, and so he'd learned to speak only when spoken to keep his opinions tucked away, even as an adult. But now, something about that photo bothered him. The image of his younger self looked hollow. Was that really him? Or had he already begun to wear a mask even then, trying to fit into the mold he'd been given? The lines around his eyes, even in youth, hinted at a quiet exhaustion, a sense of something unfulfilled. He felt the stranger in the mirror draw closer, as if looking over his shoulder, whispering, "You were never meant to be like this." He felt the urge to turn, to see if the stranger was standing there, breathing down his neck. But he resisted, forcing himself to look deeper into the photo instead, his eyes tracing over his father's stern face, his mother's half-hearted smile, and then his own hollow stare. What was I even feeling then? Memory seeped into his mind, blurred at first, but growing sharper with each second. It was the evening the photo had been taken, a family dinner, some celebration. He'd felt resentment that night. He remembered that now. He'd wanted to speak up, to say something to his father, but he hadn't. Instead, he'd smiled and nodded, saying what he knew his father wanted to hear. The room felt suddenly colder, and the objects on the table took on a ghostly quality. He set the photograph down and reached for the brittle notebook. Its pages had yellowed with time, filled with scrawled notes, dreams he'd once had. He flipped through it, each scribbled line filled with youthful longing, plans to travel the world, ideas for a novel he'd wanted to write, thoughts on starting his own business. He laughed bitterly. It was almost pathetic how quickly he'd abandoned all of these aspirations, choosing instead to follow a safer path, working a desk job he could barely stand, paying the bills, staying within the lines. A deep, mocking laugh echoed in his mind. It wasn't his voice, but it was inside him. He felt it shiver through him, the stranger's voice whispering in his ear, "These were never your dreams, Isaac. They were mine. I'm the one who wanted to live while you locked me away." Isaac dropped the notebook, its pages fanning out on the table, exposed and vulnerable, just as he felt in that moment. He could almost hear the stranger's smirk, feel its satisfaction at seeing him struggle. "This is ridiculous," he muttered aloud, trying to shake the feeling. But his own voice sounded hollow, an echo in the empty room. The apartment felt too quiet, the walls too close. Every inch of space seemed infused with a creeping sense of wrongness. He stood abruptly, pacing toward the hallway mirror, where the stranger's face waited, watching him, grinning with that infuriating confidence. His reflection held his gaze, the expression smug, almost daring him to look away. He couldn't tear his eyes from it, a horrifying realization settling over him. The face wasn't just different, it was alive. He spoke, his voice rough, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop them. "What do you want from me?" The stranger's eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction. Isaac could almost feel the response before it came, a prickling chill across his skin. "I want you to remember." The voice was low, intimate, as though the stranger were whispering in his ear. He stumbled back from the mirror, his mind racing, flashes of memories surfacing with jarring clarity. Moments he'd buried, suppressed. The time he'd stood silent while his best friend in high school took the fall for a prank he'd masterminded. The time he'd let a coworker take credit for his idea just to avoid confrontation. The time he'd ended a relationship with a woman he loved simply because commitment had terrified him. Each memory was like a slap to the face, each one revealing a part of himself he'd long denied. The stranger's face reflected them all, wearing each regret, each hidden ambition like a trophy. Isaac could feel the walls of his mind bending, breaking, as the truth clawed its way to the surface. He'd spent his entire life hiding, afraid to take ownership of his desires, his ambitions, his faults. The stranger had been there all along, waiting for him to acknowledge what he'd buried deep within. The room seemed to spin around him, a nauseating whirl of memories and half-buried thoughts, until he found himself back at the table, staring blankly at the cracked wristwatch. He picked it up, running his thumb over the fracture in the glass. He'd worn this watch every day until it broke one night during a heated argument with his father. He'd never admitted the anger he felt that night, the resentment that had burned in his chest. Instead, he'd shoved the broken watch in a drawer and moved on, pretending it hadn't happened. As he held the watch, the stranger's face appeared in his mind's eye, clear as day, grinning with dark approval. Isaac gripped the watch tighter, feeling its jagged edge press into his skin until a drop of blood beaded on his thumb, but he couldn't bring himself to let go. The pain was grounding, a reminder of something he'd hidden, even from himself. A reminder that maybe he'd never been as pure, as good, as he'd tried to make himself believe. In the dim light, Isaac finally looked down at his hands, noticing the blood smearing across his thumb, mingling with the dust from the old watch. The stranger's voice whispered in his ear, low and insistent. "This is who you are, Isaac. You can't hide from me anymore." He felt a sick, twisting thrill in his stomach, a nauseating blend of terror and exhilaration. The face in the mirror had won this round, but as he sat alone, holding the remnants of his past, he began to wonder if he'd ever really had a choice. Isaac's gaze drifted back to the hallway mirror, where his reflection waited, silent, patient, a dark, twisted reflection of everything he'd tried so hard to deny. And for the first time, he felt something shift within him, a glimmer of recognition, an understanding that went deeper than fear. He was starting to remember. Isaac hadn't left his apartment in days. He wasn't sure how many exactly. Time had lost its grip on him, each hour bleeding into the next, a seamless haze of self-reflection and isolation. Outside his window, the world went on in its usual distant hum, but it felt foreign, unreal. His world was now confined to the shadowed corners of his small, silent space, where his true self had finally begun to take shape. The hallway mirror had become a point of obsession. Each time he passed it, he felt the stranger watching him, waiting with that dark, twisted grin. It was more than just a face now. It was a presence, a weight pressing down on his mind, urging him to face the truth he'd kept buried for so long. This morning, Isaac stood before the mirror, breath fogging the glass, as he took in the stranger's face, his own face, yet something entirely different. The reflection moved as he did, but with a certain languidness, a subtle sense of defiance, as if the stranger was savoring Isaac's discomfort. His skin prickled, the quiet terror of confronting something intimately familiar yet deeply foreign. "You've been hiding from me all your life," the stranger's voice murmured from somewhere within his mind, not from his own mouth, yet undeniably his. He flinched, but held his ground, locking eyes with the reflection, forcing himself to face it. I know," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. The admission felt like a blade slicing through his chest, freeing something raw and vulnerable inside him. He felt the weight of his past, each hidden ambition, each unspoken truth. Moments flooded his mind, memories from every stage of his life, instances where he'd silenced the parts of himself he was afraid to let show. The stranger's face softened, a ghost of a smile playing on its lips. But this smile wasn't mocking. It was knowing. "See?" it seemed to say, as if congratulating him. That wasn't so hard, was it? The silence stretched, heavy with anticipation, daring him to go further. Isaac took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, sensing that what he did next would define everything. "I always thought," he hesitated, his words trembling. "I always thought that this part of me was dangerous. I didn't want to be like that." The stranger's expression shifted, taking on a look of almost pity. It was unsettling, yet at the same time, strangely comforting. "Dangerous," it echoed, voice a murmur in his mind, barely a breath. What you call dangerous is the part of you that's real. The words stung, resonating with a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. He thought back to every instance he'd shied away from his own desires, every time he'd let others take the lead, every chance he'd let slip by, simply because he was afraid. Afraid of standing out, afraid of rejection, afraid of facing the raw, unfiltered parts of himself that didn't fit the mold he'd been given. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that fear, letting it settle in his chest. I've been afraid my whole life. The thought surfaced with a calm acceptance, a final acknowledgement of everything he'd denied. He opened his eyes, and the stranger's face was still there, watching him with a strange sense of pride. I am you, it whispered. Everything you've denied, everything you've locked away. You've kept me hidden because you thought I would destroy you, but you're only hurting yourself. The words struck deep, a painful truth he couldn't ignore. He'd always believed that this side of him, the assertive, ambitious side, the side that wanted, the side that didn't care about blending in, was something dangerous, something he had to keep buried. But now, as he faced it, he began to see it differently. It wasn't dangerous, it was honest. Slowly, he raised his hand, pressing it against the mirror, his fingers aligning with those of his reflection. The cold glass felt solid, grounding, and he felt a strange sense of unity, like something broken inside him was beginning to mend. The stranger's hand pressed back, mirroring him perfectly, and for the first time, Isaac felt as if he were truly looking at himself. "Tell me who you are," Isaac whispered, his voice steady, the fear slipping away. The reflection's gaze softened, and in that moment, the face began to shift, features blurring and merging, until Isaac could no longer tell where the stranger ended and he began. "I am everything you've denied. I am your ambition, your anger, your passion. I am the part of you that wants to live without fear. I am you, Isaac." Isaac felt a strange warmth fill his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. It was acceptance, a quiet understanding of the truth that had always been there, waiting for him to find the courage to face it. He wasn't just the quiet, cautious man he'd tried to be. He was also the person who wanted more, the person who was willing to take risks, who craved something greater. As he looked into the mirror, his face, not the stranger's, stared back at him. The edges of the smirk lingered, a hint of defiance and confidence, but this time it felt like his own expression, a natural part of who he was. He didn't flinch from it. Instead, he embraced it. Isaac took a step back, his reflection moving with him, and he felt the shift inside, the sense of unity between the man he'd tried to be and the man he truly was. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a tentative bridge between his past and his future. The room felt brighter, as if a weight had been lifted, the air lighter, more breathable. He turned away from the mirror, feeling as though he'd finally been released from a prison he hadn't known he was in. The ghostly memories of missed opportunities, of regret and suppressed desire drifted away, leaving him with a sense of calm, a newfound strength. For the first time in days, Isaac opened the door to his apartment and stepped outside. The world seemed sharper, more vivid, as if he were seeing it through new eyes. Each face he passed on the street held a familiarity, a sense of shared struggle, as though he were seeing the masks others wore, the hidden parts they kept locked away. He looked at his reflection in a store window, and this time he saw himself fully. a man who had faced his darkness, his fears, his desires. The smirk lingered at the corner of his mouth, a hint of the stranger he had once been. But now, it was a part of him, an integrated whole. As he walked away, he couldn't help but glance back, catching one last glimpse of his reflection. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow, a faint, familiar smile watching him, a reminder of the journey he'd taken, of the face he'd finally learned to wear with pride. And then it was gone, leaving him with nothing but his own reflection and the quiet, unshakable truth that he was, at last, complete.